Welcome to American History Lesson 3. Establishing the colonies. Our lesson objectives are: analyze and understand the relationship between England and the American colonies, compare the similarities and differences of Northern and Southern American colonial lifestyle, including social status and economy, identify and understand how intellectual movements would impact the American colonies, identify and understand challenges to England's control of the American colonies. England's rule of the American colonies. European nations wanted to create colonies in the New World because they wanted an economic system called mercantilism. Mercantilism is when a country builds small colonies around the world to exploit the wealth of that region. England would benefit from the mercantile system in the North American colonies because they could buy materials not easily found in England, such as lumber, furs, grain, and tobacco. The colonies would then buy furniture, iron tools, cookware, books, and fine china made in England, creating an economic market where the English colonies would remain dependent on England. The English Parliament then passed the Navigation Acts to control the colonial trade. The Navigation Acts prevented the colonies from selling certain types of materials to other nations. The Navigation Act said that all goods included in the colonial trade had to travel on English or colonial ships and be unloaded first at English ports before shipping to other ports. Despite these actions, there were some colonial merchants who traded illegally with other countries. In 1684, the English king tried to enforce these laws on the merchants of Massachusetts. Their actions failed, so the king revoked the colony's charter and appointed Sir Edmund Andros as the new royal governor. Sir Andros would outlaw local government and created new taxes which angered the colonists even more. Relations between England and the American colonies would improve when the English Parliament chose a new king and queen to rule England in 1688. The new English government restored the colony's charter, but they passed tough new trade laws. These laws moved smuggling trials to English-controlled courts and created a board of trade. The new English government was not able to enforce these laws too well. Under the new system, the royal governors headed each colony, but the colonial legislative assemblies held a great deal of power. The governor could veto any of the laws that were passed, but the assemblies had the power to raise taxes. In this way, they controlled the governor's salary. With this system of checks and balances, the colonies could practice a certain amount of self-governing. Lifestyle in the American colonies. Colonists on from Maryland to Georgia specialized in one cash crop. A cash crop is a farm product that is raised or produced for sale and not just for the farmer's personal use. Some cash crops include tobacco, rice, and indigo. Planters raised these crops on large farms called plantations along the rivers. Southern society was mostly rural, with only a few larger cities. Charlestown, later called Charleston, in South Carolina, was the only major city of the South. Even though the small farmers were the majority in the South, the planters dominated both economic and political life. The lifestyle of Southern women was very restrictive, as they were not allowed to vote, attend school, or own property. Women had to work long hours on the farm and manage the household duties. The indentured servants in the South had very few rights during their service. Once their service was complete, they then struggled to survive on their own. By the late 1600s, there were not many indentured servants coming to the colonies. To have the labor needed on the plantations, planters brought over many thousands of slaves from Africa. The African slave trade was a huge supply of workers that existed for many, many years. This was a brutal practice. Many times African slaves were branded with red-hot branding irons and forced to travel in the crowded holds of ships across the Atlantic Ocean to a strange land. At least 20% of slaves died from this inhumane treatment or disease contracted during the voyage. The slaves who survived were the main labor force on the plantations. It is estimated that up to 90% of the slaves worked in the fields, while the remaining worked in planters' houses. Some slaves were allowed to learn skills such as carpentry or blacksmithing. Many children started to work as young as 12. Sometimes slaves would resist by pretending to be sick or by working too slowly. In the Stono Rebellion of 1739, a group of slaves fought for their freedom, but all were killed. Some slaves attempted to run away and sometimes found a new home in Native American tribes. Even though Africans were forced from their native homes, they developed their own culture drawn on the crafts, stories, and music of their African homes. The economies of the New England and Middle colonies were becoming diverse. Farming was still important, though especially in the wheat and corn regions of Pennsylvania and New York. Other growing industries included grinding wheat, fishing, and shipbuilding. By the 1770s, the colonists were producing a third of all the British ships and produced more iron than Great Britain. Boston and New York became thriving cities, and Philadelphia was the second largest port in the British Empire. The northern colonies enjoyed a diverse population. Pennsylvania was a home for many Germans who were escaping poverty or religious persecution. Another large population group was the Scottish Protestants from Ireland. Also included were the Dutch, Scandinavians, and Jews. The northern colonies had African slaves, but not as many as in the South. African slaves were treated badly in the northern colonies. Women in the colonial period had very little rights. Like Southern women, they worked hard in households and on the farm. Women's frustrations of their status contributed in part to the 1692 outbreak of witch hunting in Salem, Massachusetts. Several innocent women were tried and executed for being witches until the panic died down. Europe's impact on the American colonies. An intellectual movement in Europe called the Enlightenment gradually affected the colonies. Enlightenment thinkers valued reason and science over the tradition and superstition. Benjamin Franklin demonstrated this way of thinking in an experiment by showing that lightning was a form of electricity. Enlightenment ideas spread through the colonies partly because of the high number of males learning to read. Fun fact. Benjamin Franklin provided guitar lessons, wanted the turkey to be the national bird of the United States, and produced the first non-English language newspaper in the American colonies. While the Enlightenment supported science, the Great Awakening was a series of religious revival in the 1730s and 1740s. Jonathan Edwards, one of the leaders in the movement, challenged the authority of the church. The Enlightenment and the Great Awakening led colonists to question authority. The French were challenging the British in North America just as they were in Europe. The French had control of the entire Mississippi River Valley, but did not have many settlers as the British. Because the French were interested in the fur trade, they developed friendly relations with many Native Americans. The rivalry between the English and the French, with the French and Indian War, which lasted from 1754 to 1763. The war was started by Virginia troops led by George Washington, who marched to the Ohio River to drive out the French from that area. The French and their Native American allies defeated both this force as well as the British Army the next year. Then the British defeated the French at Quebec in 1759. This defeat required France to give Canada to the British and New Orleans to Spain. Although they won, the British troubles were not over. Native Americans did not like the colonists, continued to move and showed their dislike through forced resistance. Pontiac's uprising captured 8 British forts. The British defeated Pontiac and then banned any settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, which did not sit well with the colonists. The French and Indian War caused still other problems for the British. The British stationed 10,000 troops in the colonies to try and keep the peace. Colonists thought the troops were being used to suppress their rights. The British and colonists disagreed over British methods of raising money to pay for the war. When the royal governor of Massachusetts issued search warrants to find smugglers, the colonists heavily protested. A new British law, the Sugar Act of 1764, placed duties or taxes on imports that were previously untaxed, and it changed the rules for prosecuting smuggling cases. Colonists claimed that this new law violated their rights. What next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submission should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite sources in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation, the author's surname, and the date of publication within parentheses straight after a direct quote. Citationmachine.net will assist you in creating citations.